How's it going? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I'm an organizational psychologist and best-selling author of multiple books, including Be Your Future Self Now, which is a breakdown of all the latest science in positive psychology and neuroscience on the future self phenomenon. This is one of the biggest ideas. Really, this is where the future of psychology is going. I'm also the author of 10x is easier than 2x. And in this video, I'm going to share my screen and break down the one-page future self cheat sheet, which you can download at futureself.com. Also at futureself.com, you can download the 4 tools that I talk about in this book: the Future Self Commit tool, the Future Self Connect tool, the Imagination tool, and the 3 Priorities tool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and break down the one-page Future Self cheat sheet. So this cheat sheet is pretty thick, but it breaks down a lot of the core concepts about how to alter your identity. The goal here is that you begin to identify and operate as your future self rather than operating as your past self. And the key component there is a concept called psychological flexibility. So psychological flexibility is a key concept. Think about the opposite. The opposite of psychological flexibility would be psychological rigidity. If you're psychologically or emotionally rigid, what that means is that you're holding on to many aspects of your past. You have a hard time becoming even emotionally aware or even consciously aware of your past self. If you want to become your future self, and if you want to operate from the identity of your future self, you're going to definitely need to increase your psychological flexibility. I talk about that a lot in Future Self as well as 10x. A key aspect of psychological flexibility is viewing yourself more as a context rather than content. If you view yourself as a context, you realize that like any context, you can expand the context, you can change the context. It's just kind of like rearranging a house as an example. You can change the context, you can take out a wall, you can move it. By the way, this is a big aspect of identity. A big aspect of identity is your story and your narrative, and how you view your past is simply how you contextualize that past, how you frame it. It's like the story of it. And so when you take an experience, say a trauma from your past, and you recontextualize it, you look at it from a different perspective, different angles, you include different views and different aspects. By recontextualizing it, by changing the context, you change the meaning of the content. You not only want to get good at reframing your past and past experiences, but you also want to get better at reframing yourself as a context. And when you do that, you can then see that you're the observer of your thoughts and emotions. You are not those thoughts and emotions. Another aspect of psychological flexibility, which is really important for your identity, is that the more connected you get to your future self, the more you begin mapping out your future self and becoming aware of your future self and thinking about your future self. What you really want to do is you want your future to determine your present rather than the opposite. Most people, they're letting the present determine the future. They're also letting the past determine the present. When you become really psychologically flexible and really powerful, what you do is you get really connected to an exciting, powerful, purposeful future self, and you let the future determine who you are, what you do, and who you're being in the present. In other words, you map out your desired future self, but then you adopt the identity of your future self. This goes into a concept of being, then doing, then having. You be your future self, you do what your future self would do, and you have what your future self would have. This takes a lot of flexibility because obviously your future self is a very different person than you are. That's actually right here. Just a massive understanding that your future self is a very different person than you. They've got different skills, knowledge, perspective. They have a different model for viewing the world. They have different priorities. And so the more you get connected to your future self, by the way, Albert Einstein said, and I share it later on in here, but Albert Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. And Dr. Daniel Gilbert, he gave a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. This was on the main stage, TED 2014. I recommend you watch that video. But one of the things that Dr. Daniel Gilbert did, and I break this down over here, down here a little bit further, but this is something I highly recommend you do. And if you go to futureself.com and download the tools, I've created a few tools to help you do this. But even if you just pull out your journal, and I would challenge you, don't spend more than 2 pages on this and no more than 5 minutes per page. It's nice if you just view your past and your future as a draft, the draft of a book. And you're always recontextualizing the draft of your past and always recontextualizing the draft of your future. And your views of your past and your future are ultimately what shape your experience in the present. Because from a psychological standpoint, time is holistic, not sequential. What I mean by that is that the past that you have and the view you have of it, you're still carrying with you, and it's informing everything you're doing now, just as the future that you most see for yourself is also with you right now and informing everything you're doing. There's 2 quotes on this. One's going to be about the past and one's going to be about the future. I'll share the future one first. I love this quote from Dan Sullivan. He said, "The only way to make your present better is by making your future bigger." I would say that's only half the equation, because not only do you want to make your future bigger and more purposeful, and by the way, that's one of the key things that Viktor Frankl talks about in Man's Search for Meaning. He talks heavily in that book, and that book is all about his experience in the Holocaust during World War II. But what Viktor Frankl talked about in that book is that when you don't have a purpose for your future, then your present loses meaning. And then what you do is you become retrospective, begin looking at your past and wishing that you could go back in time because the present is so painful and because you have no future. This is why hope and purpose are so powerful. And hope, at the end of the day, from a psychological standpoint, is really about committed purpose. Hope is a very powerful concept in psychology. It's not just, I hope that this happens. True hope is having a committed purpose and then ultimately having what psychologists would call pathways thinking, which is a big aspect of psychological flexibility, where you continuously find or adjust or create new pathways or meanses to get to your committed purpose. People who have low hope, and there's a lot of research that breaks down the difference between high hope and low hope people, but people with low hope, because they're not committed, number one, therefore they don't have high pathways thinking, which means that they just try the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result, which is obviously the definition of insanity by Albert Einstein. So when you get highly committed, there's two great quotes on this. One from Nietzsche, which was basically Viktor Frankl's favorite quote. He said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." What that means is that no matter how rough or tough or bad your current conditions, you can bear those conditions if you have a why to live for. In other words, if you have a future purpose that you have hope in and are excited about, then you can handle rough, challenging, difficult situations in the present because that purpose in your future gives your life meaning, it gives it purpose, it gives you resilience, it gives you something to strengthen yourself for. And honestly, it helps you develop yourself spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and helps you take the current situation and develop what psychologists would call deliberate practice, where you convert your experiences into your future self. This also fits with a lot of the research on what's called epigenetics. Epigenetics talks about how our genes are largely turned on and off based on our environment, but on our inputs, but also, more importantly, our perception of those inputs. So you have input, you also have process, and it's how you process the inputs that determines your outputs. So as an example, two people could have the same input. Two people could go through the same traumatic experience, but one of those people processes it in a negative way, and therefore their output and also their biology holds that trauma and it's detrimental. Whereas another person could have the same input, but process it in a positive way. They take ownership over that processing, which is a lot of psychological and emotional flexibility, and they ultimately determine what that input means. This is when you start taking ownership of your past and start transforming your past and healing your past so that your past becomes an asset rather than a liability. If your past is a liability, then it's going to continue to cost your present and your future selves. Whereas if your past becomes an asset, then what that means is that you're continually gaining and growing and getting benefits from your past, making your present and future selves bigger and better. And so the key here is that you got to realize your future self is up to you. You get to imagine your future self. And Dr. Daniel Gilbert said a lot of people just don't take the time to do it. On this cheat sheet, I recommend you do two things. One, and again, take out your journal, take 5 minutes and write down all the ways you're different from your past self. This is a key concept. You're not the same person as your past self was, but also you're not the same person as your future self. Your future self is going to be very different. One of the things that allows you to see, and I hit this bullet point right here, and I also reference Brene Brown, that your present self is as present and fleeting as the present moment. That's what Dr. Daniel Gilbert said. And so when you realize that you're not your past self, but you also realize you're not your future self, what that means is that your current self is very flexible and adaptive. That's a great place to be. That's what Carol Dweck would call a growth mindset. The opposite of a growth mindset is a fixed mindset. And if you have a fixed mindset, then what that means is that you're trying to prove yourself. You've also overly boxed in your identity, overly defined who you are, and it's based on a past. If you have a fixed mindset, you're letting the past dictate who you are in the present and who you'll be in the future. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you realize your future self is going to be a very different person than you are in the present, and you're more interested in getting it right than trying to be right. That's the quote right here from Brene Brown. Brene Brown said, "It's a lot more powerful to try to get it right than trying to be right." If you're trying to be right, what that means is you have a fixed mindset and you're trying to prove yourself. I don't need to prove myself because I know my future self, even 24 hours from now, is going to be a lot more informed than I am right now. My current self is very ignorant, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I also recognize that my past self was also ignorant, but I love my past self. The key here is massive compassion on all levels of your identity. Massive compassion for your past self, recognizing that you're not your past self, massive understanding that they had a different context, different situation, different experiences, different purpose. And so rather than being upset at your past self, you massively love, have great gratitude, and you continually learn from your past self. You want to carry around a positive past and a purposeful future, because we're always walking around with our past and our future. And so you want to always refine and improve your past, always refine and clarify your future. In the present, you're just working on learning more and more and continuing to learn and grow, which is the massive growth mindset. So on page 1 of your journal, just write down all the ways you're different from your past self 10 years ago. And then what I would have you do on page 2 is write down your future self 10 years from now, write down the date. I'm filming this on May 30th of 2023. So I could write May 30th, 2033. At that point, I'll be 45 years old. And I just write down where I see my life. One thing I would have you do, though, is do your past self first and write down all the ways you're different and your life is different from where it was 10 years ago. And then what I would invite you to do is look at those changes and then make the changes for your future self at least 10 times bigger and more important, bigger and better changes. Because most people, they underestimate how much their future self will change, because most people, they take the present and they project it onto the future. What that means is that they assume that the future is going to look a lot like the present, and most people don't think their future self is going to be much different from their present self. What I'm inviting you to do, and what Albert Einstein invites you to do, and what the psychology research invites you to do, is first recognize your future self as a very different person than you. But second off, take ownership of that imagination. Your future self can be 10x different and better in key ways than you are right now. And if you have a growth mindset, you have experienced this before. So I invite you to look at your past growth after you've written it down. Journal about your life and how you're different from your past self 10 years ago. And then if you review those changes, look ahead 10 years, but make the change from your current to your future 10 times bigger and more and better change than the changes you had in your past, so that you change and transform your life at least 10x more over the next 10 years than you have over the last 10 years. And just to find out who your future self is, where they're at, what their life is like, what their core priorities are. There's a great quote from Jim Collins. He said, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have 0. So what is the core priorities of your future self? What do they care about? What matters to them? And then if you want to start being your future self now and becoming more psychologically flexible, you'll clarify what's important to your future self 10 years from now. And then you'll start using that future to determine who you are and what you do in the present. In other words, you let the future dictate the present, but also you let the present to dictate the past. You always, in the present, reframe and transform the meaning of the past so that it's increasingly valuable and it's increasingly happening for you, not to you. In other words, the past is an asset, but the future is also an asset, because the future gives you a tool to continually transform yourself and become your future self. So this is the future self tool. Your future self is your greatest guide. They love you. Be true to them and you'll do well. This is what the research shows, is that the more connected you get to your future self, the more intentional you'll live in the present. So you want your future to dictate who you are, what you do, and how you live in the present. And then you want to let go of the aspects of your past that are holding you back, but always recognize that you're not your past self, but have massive compassion, love, and empathy for them. Thank you for this. I hope you enjoyed it. Go to futureself.com if you want to download the actual tool and the other tools from Be Your Future Self Now, and have an amazing day. See you.